Oliver the Famous Engine. Along the coast on the Island of Sodor runs a small branch line that the engines call the Little Western, named after Duck and Oliver, who were both Great Western and proud of it. The Little Western was very busy in the summertime, as holidaymakers used the branch line to travel to many of the seaside villages and beaches. Duck and Oliver loved the summer excitement and happily ran up and down the coastline, taking their passengers wherever they wanted to go. But now, autumn was approaching, which meant that there were fewer holidaymakers and fewer trains to the seaside. "It's nice to have a chance to rest our wheels," Duck said one afternoon. Oliver agreed, but he also felt that the end of summer was a little bittersweet. It hadn't been long since Douglas had helped Oliver escape from scrap, and he had been enjoying his first summer on Sodor immensely.
"I'll miss the enthusiasts and the warm summer air," Oliver said sadly. "They reminded me of how wonderful it is to be a free engine again."
"I understand," Duck sympathized. "You spent a long time hiding in that cold, damp yard on the other railway."
"If Douglas hadn't found me there, we would have been scrap for sure,"
Toad the brake van agreed.
"Oh, I shudder to think about it, Mr. Oliver. But we've been very happy here."
"Oh, yes,"
Oliver concurred.
"When all the branch lines closed down back home, we didn't know what to do. But now, Sodor feels like home."
"I'm glad to hear you say that," said Duck. "You certainly fit in well, and the passengers adore you."
"Yes, it's been nice to see happy faces instead of the mean scowls of diesels."
"You're safe here, Oliver. And remember, we'll always have passengers, and there's always next summer." This made Oliver feel much better. Later that day, Sir Topham Hatt came to see the two engines.
"Though the busy summer season is coming to a close, we do have an important visitor coming on holiday to the island."
Duck and Oliver were intrigued.
"He's an old friend of mine. He works as the controller for the other railway."
Oliver stiffened. He hadn't thought about the controller of the other railway since his rescue. He and Douglas had pretended that he was being taken for scrap to escape the other railway. Oliver was afraid that if the controller came, he might discover that one of his engines had been taken under his nose.
"Oliver, I'd like you to take him to the coastal cottages when he arrives tomorrow."
Oliver's colors drained with the news, but he mustered a weak,
"Thank you, sir."
And Sir Topham Hatt went back to his car. "Oliver, are you okay?" Duck inquired. He could see fear in Oliver's face. Duck had never seen Oliver react this way before. But then he understood. "Oliver, I can take the train tomorrow if it's going to be too difficult for you," offered Duck.
"Thank you, Duck, but it's already been arranged."
"We don't have to tell Sir Topham Hatt," Duck replied, smiling. "I'll tell you what. You take my trucks tomorrow, and I'll take the special train. One engine for another." Oliver thought for a moment and agreed with the new plan. Their drivers made the arrangements with the station master, who sympathized with the situation. The next day, Duck set out with the coaches to pick up the controller, and Oliver left with Duck's goods train. When Duck arrived, the controller was surprised to see him.
"I'm pleased to meet you, but you're not Oliver, are you?"
Uh-oh, Duck thought. They'll know we changed the schedule. Duck knew that they might get in trouble, but he also knew that Oliver was afraid that he might be sent back to the other railway.
"No matter," continued the controller. "I just wanted to meet Oliver. He's a very famous engine, you know."
"Famous?" Duck asked.
"Oh, yes! The harrowing tale of his escape has been all over the news. I've always been a proponent of steam preservation, and am glad he found a home here."
Duck sighed with relief. "Beg pardon, sir, but Oliver was afraid that you were coming to take him back to the other railway."
"No, not at all. I'm glad he is safe. When I heard that he had come to the island of Sodor, I knew I needed to meet this impressive engine."
"I'm sure that Oliver would appreciate hearing this from you," Duck said. Oliver was shunting trucks in the yard when Duck approached with the controller's coach in tow. Oliver was so shocked he accidentally bumped one of his trucks into the buffers.
"Duck, what are you doing here?"
he said. "To bring a special visitor to meet a famous engine," Duck replied, smiling.
A famous engine?"
Oliver was thoroughly confused. Out stepped the controller from the other railway. Oliver was guarded at first, but the controller greeted him so warmly that Oliver was disarmed.
"Oliver, how good it is to meet you," said the controller,
and explained what he had told Duck earlier that day.
Thank you, sir. I had no idea,"
Oliver replied, flabbergasted.
"You certainly are an impressive engine, Oliver, and I commend your heroism. I've told my diesels that if they ever badger a steam engine again, they'll be punished."
Oliver simply beamed. From then on, Oliver had a renewed sense of purpose. While the scrapyard is still difficult for him to think about, Oliver now feels happy in his work year-round, because he knows that even those he thought were against him are cheering for him from far away. Thin ice. Duck and Oliver were agitated. The winter weather had struck the coast, and their branch line felt the brunt of it. Snow piled high on the cliffsides, and ice glazed the rails. The engines had to ensure they had plenty of sand to stop their wheels from slipping. One morning, Oliver was bringing passengers to the big station. He was feeling pleased with himself. Too pleased, in fact. He hadn't realized he had no sand left, and when it came time to brake, his wheels spun helplessly.
"Stop! Stop!"
he groaned. Finally, with a sigh of relief, Oliver came to a halt. The passengers grumbled, while the coaches tittered quietly. Oliver was embarrassed. Then he heard more laughter.
"Giving up your working life to become an ice dancer, are you?"
There, in the car park, was Bulgy.
"I just ran out of sand," grumbled Oliver. "Nothing to get excited about." "Ha!" sniffed Bulgy. "You were practically a runaway. You'd never catch me slipping on my roads. Your passengers would be much better off in my care."
With that, Bulgy roared away. Oliver rolled his eyes. Now, Bulgy was trying to be on his best behavior. His collision with the bridge that summer had caused a great deal of trouble. The bus company had been quite clear that further lies and slip-ups would not be tolerated. Even so, Bulgy couldn't resist a chance to taunt the engines. Bulgy was on his way back to the bus depot and had to drive down a long country road. Contrary to his boasting to Oliver, he did need to be mindful. The roads were wrought with black ice. However, his sturdy tires gripped well, and he felt pleased.
No slips from me, he chuckled.
Up ahead, Caroline was trundling slowly along. Steady now, she mumbled anxiously. Her tires were worn, and she was being extra careful. Before long, Bulgy came up behind her, honking angrily.
Get a move on,
he shouted. How rude, retorted Caroline. Go around, you brute. Bulgy didn't need telling twice. He swerved to pass Caroline when it happened. His tires hit a patch of black ice. Oh, he cried. Help! But it was too late. Bulgy leaned and toppled off the road into a snowy ditch close to the railway.
Ouch, he wailed. Please, get help.
Oh, all right, sighed Caroline. As soon as I get to the station. Bulgy sighed. Knowing Caroline, that wouldn't be any time soon. He was most surprised when, not long after, Oliver arrived with the cranes.
Oh dear, said Oliver.
Had a bit of a spill, Bulgy. Lucky you didn't have any passengers. I doubt they'd appreciate your ice dance routine.
Bulgy said nothing as Oliver pulled him back to the yard. The owner was waiting.
Bulgy, he said sternly, I demand an explanation.
Bulgy was suddenly very worried. He knew it was his fault.
It was that Caroline, sir, he stammered. She cut me off. I had to swerve to avoid crashing into her.
She did not,
interrupted Oliver.
I was bringing my return train when you pulled your little maneuver. We saw you crash and brought the cranes as fast as we could.
Bulgy gulped. He'd been caught. The owner, red-faced, turned back to Bulgy.
Aha! There you go, lying once again.
But please, sir, give me another chance.
Certainly not, interrupted the owner. I've had more than enough of your fibs. It's clear you'll never learn. No repairs for you. You'll stay here until I figure out what to do with you. Good day.
The owner strode off, leaving everyone, even Oliver, at a loss for words. The winter months finally came to an end. The trains ran as usual, and Oliver had no more trouble with icy rails. And Bulgy? I'm afraid things only got worse. No one wanted a dishonest bus, and certainly not one in Bulgy's condition. Bulgy is certain he'll be back on the road in due time. But the hens pay no attention.
Across the island of Sodor, there is a need for all sorts of goods. From food and cattle to timber and coal, the island cannot operate without goods trains running both night and day. Goods trains carry cargo that is either coming to the island or is being taken to the harbour to be loaded onto ships for export to other areas of the world. Many different types of trucks make up goods trains. There are wooden plank wagons which can hold coal, stone, scrap and many other things. Box vans can hold larger goods items and can even be refrigerated. Bolster wagons carry long awkward items such as logs and heavy boxes. Trucks can be prone to mischief, but at their core they understand that they are an asset to the railway. Many of the trucks like to talk to the engines outside of work. Indeed, all trucks were very friendly once an engine got to know them. However, there was once a truck who was not friendly at all. In fact, he was a very, very awful truck. It has been said that something went wrong when his builder constructed him. A rivet was out of line, or his wood was rotten. No one quite knows. What was certain is that he placed many engines in a great deal of danger, but one day he went too far. The morning was brisk when it happened. A thick fog had descended on the island, and Percy the Green Engine had arrived at the quarry to arrange his trucks for his first trip down the branch line. He was very tired that morning and wasn't attending to what he was doing. The evil truck, due to his dangerous nature, had been placed on a remote siding to prevent engines from using him, but Percy's grogness and the thick fog caused him to misjudge which siding he took trucks from. Without knowing, he had placed the evil truck at the head of the train. The foreman didn't recognise the mistake either and loaded the wagons without objection. The time came for Percy to leave and he pulled out of the quarry, none the wiser that disaster lay ahead. The evil truck, in his narrow mind, began hatching an awful scheme. If I and the trucks hold back at just the right time, we can pull Percy off the rails. The branch line ran around sharp curves on a steep hill. If an engine was to fall off the rails, he might slide down the hill and crash into one of the many neighbouring cottages. Sir Topham had placed fences along the track to prevent this, but the evil truck had other plans. After Percy had cleared the waterfall, he started down the first bend. The evil truck screeched on his brakes, signalling to the other trucks to hold back. The sudden force pulled on Percy's rear coupler, picking his front wheels off the rails. "Oh, oh, oh!" Percy cried. Then the truck surged ahead, and with a crack of a coupling, Percy came off the rails onto the crest of the hill. His wheels, still moving, began to grip the sod and he jerked forward down the hill. The fog was so thick that he couldn't see where he was going, but the evil truck knew. "Goodbye, Percy," he croaked. Percy tumbled and tumbled until he saw the outline of a cottage ahead. "Oh, horrors!" yelled Percy. Sensing the impending crash, Percy's driver and fireman jumped from the footplate. Meanwhile, the evil truck had forced the train's brakes so he could stop and listen. From the top of the hill, the truck heard the sounds of wood splintering and the muffled cries of those inside. He began to cackle madly. "Stupid engine needs to look where he's going next time," the evil truck guffawned. The other trucks were horrified. "What have you done? You lied to us!" they screamed. "You're a psychopath! We were only going to scare Percy!" one truck said. "Yeah, you're insane," another truck added. "We didn't expect this to happen." But the evil truck didn't care. His laughter echoed over the hills and below to where Percy lay, battered and bruised, regretting ever placing the evil truck in his train that morning. The tragic accident left a deep scar indeed. Percy was mended, but the lives of those in the cottage were lost. In disgrace, Sir Topham had scrapped the evil truck immediately. From then on, he was very careful about the character of the trucks he brought to the island, to prevent such an awful affair from ever happening again.
Sir Topham Hack's engines were proud to work on the island of Sodor. Though the railway was very busy, the engines worked together to get the work done. Each engine had their own unique strengths that allowed them to perform their individual duties with ease. Some engines, like Thomas and Percy, were small and well suited for lighter branch line work. Engines like Gordon and Henry were big and strong and designed for fast mainline traffic. James and Edward were mixed traffic engines that could pull big and small trains equally well. There were other important members of the railway too, such as the coaches and trucks. Without their ability to hold passengers or goods, it would be impossible to travel or move necessary supplies across the island. Unfortunately, the engines often forget to recognize their coaches and trucks for their contributions. There was an old van who lived on the island. He spent his days moving from one side of the island to the other, being loaded, unloaded, and loaded again. It was not hard work, but it was lonely. He never got as much as a hello from the engines. He was not prone to mischief like some of the other trucks, but he was often bumped only because that's just the way engines treated trucks. One day, James was at the big station preparing the slow goods to be taken to the junction at the end of the line. He hated it. "I'd much rather be pulling the express," he fumed. James bumped the trucks furiously as he arranged them into a neat line. Come on, he screeched. "I shan't have any silliness today. I want to finish before nightfall." James, grumbling dreadfully, shunted the last few trucks in line, a few loaded flat wagons and the old van. The van felt sad. He had barely moved and was already being harassed. He wanted to say something to James, but he knew he'd only get bumped again. "Why so glum?" called a friendly voice. The van looked over and was surprised to see Henry and Gordon sitting in the yard. He was not accustomed to being addressed by engines, especially big engines. The van stuttered. "I'm just tired." Gordon chuckled. "Tired of being bumped, James is the worse for that." The van hadn't received as much as one shred of compassion before. He felt warm inside. Yes, we get bumped a lot. Sometimes we get bumped even if we did nothing wrong. Henry and Gordon were embarrassed. "I'm sorry, my friend," Henry said. "We were taught that we should assume that trucks are going to misbehave, and we should bump them no matter what." "We are so used to doing this that we never stop to think how it affects you," Gordon added. "Well, we're sorry for acting up so often. I think that because we never get to know you, that we feel like we must misbehave for you to notice us." "We had no idea that's why you act out. How can we help you feel more comfortable?" "Well, we would appreciate if you took some time to talk to us during your day," the van said. "We would feel much more included." "Of course," Henry said. "That would be our pleasure." The van simply beamed. The signal dropped and it was time for James and his slow goods train to leave. "Thank you for talking to me," said the van. "The other engines ignore us. It makes me feel good to know that not all engines think we're silly." "Not at all," Henry replied. "We're glad to have a new friend." James, while waiting for the signal, had overheard the entire conversation and felt awful about it for the rest of the journey. At the last station, after he set down his trucks, he spoke to the old van. "I am so sorry for bumping you earlier," James said softly. "It's okay. I'm just pleased to be talking to you," the van smiled. The two chatted for a while, and James left to go back to the sheds. The van felt a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer felt like he was a cog in the system, but a true member of the team. For the first time in his long life, he looked forward to going out again tomorrow.
James makes a mistake. James the Red Engine loved working on the island of Sodor. He was a mixed traffic engine and could pull both coaches and trucks quite easily. James made sure to remind everyone who would listen of just how versatile he was. The way James talked, anyone would think that he was the only engine qualified to work on the Fat Controller's railway. James had a good heart, but he was conceited. He also had a very hot temper, which I'm sorry to say got him into a lot of trouble. "I'm a very passionate engine," James would say whenever anything went wrong. "Of course, James," the other engines replied, but they knew that James wouldn't get into such messes if he wouldn't let his frustrations get the best of him. One day, James learned the value of humility the hard way. He was dozing comfortably in his shed as his fireman stoked his fire. He was warm and didn't want to move. "Show a wheel, James," called his driver. James looked cross. He did not appreciate being disturbed. "It's not time for me to leave yet," James snarled. "It is now," his driver assured him. "There's been a last-minute change to the timetable. Gordon was taken ill and due to pull the express." James was delighted. "The express," he thought to himself. "I will look splendid flying down the line." What James didn't know was that the coaches normally used for the express were at the works being repainted. The replacement coaches had only been taken out a few times and were not as nice as the other coaches. Gordon was the only engine who could handle them. He knew how to talk to coaches, but James, unfortunately, did not. James beamed as he entered the station. He looked up and down the platform as the passengers shuffled toward the coaches. "All of these passengers are here to see what a remarkable engine I am. Oh, Gordon will be jealous when he finds out that I pulled his express." The coaches heard every word. "What an arrogant engine," they chimed in unison. "We don't want him. Where is Gordon?" James, in his bliss, didn't hear the coaches and coupled up to the train, oblivious. "I say, you coaches," James shouted proudly. "I expect you to do exactly as I say. I want to beat Gordon's time no matter what." "What kind of engine does he think he is? Yes, he's not at all like Gordon. We won't go." The coaches were true to their word. After the guard's whistle, James tried to pull out of the station, but the coaches wouldn't budge. "Come on, you coaches," James shouted, steam billowing around him as his wheels spun on the rails. "Come on!" James's wheels continued to slip, but the coaches remained firmly in place. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the coupling broke and James shot forward. The coaches laughed and laughed as James stood on the line, stunned. James's temper began to boil as he realised that the coaches had played a trick on him. "If that's the way you want it, then that's the way it shall be," James muttered under his breath. Without thinking, James reared back and bumped the coaches hard, like he did with the trucks when they misbehaved. The sound echoed through the station. The passengers inside the coaches were tossed upside down and sideways. James realised his mistake immediately. "Oh my!" he cried, red in the face with embarrassment. Luckily, no one was hurt. The Fat Controller burst out onto the platform to see what all the noise was. When he saw the passengers clambering out of the coaches, he knew what had happened. "James!" he shouted. "You could have armed your passengers," the Fat Controller scolded. I'm sorry, sir," James said softly. "Saying you're sorry won't help the passengers get to their destinations. Now I will have to find new coaches and a new engine to pull them. James, you've caused confusion and delay." All James could do was look at his buffers. You will stay in the shed until you can learn to control your temper. If you can't, I shall have to send you away. James felt awful. He had a lot to think about indeed. Trial of trust. James was in disgrace after his accident with Gordon's coachers. The coachers had played a trick on the red engine, who had retaliated by bumping the coachers hard. James had forgotten that his passengers were on board, but thankfully no one had been hurt. The Fat Controller had punished James by making him stay in the sheds until he could be trusted again. James felt miserable as he watched the other engines fly by. He most hated to see Gordon, who wouldn't stop whistling at him and saying, "Poop, poop, little James just isn't ready for the big express." One morning the Fat Controller visited James. "James, I hope you have had time to think about your accident," he said sternly. "Yes, sir," James replied. "It will take more time for me to trust you to pull coaches again, but in the meantime we do need your help with the trucks." "Oh, yes, please, sir," said James, who was desperate to be out of the sheds. "Good. Once you are cleaned and fired up, run along to the big station to collect your train. Consider this a trial of trust." James ran happily along to the station, where he found a small goods train to take to the junction. He was coupled up and waited for the signal. He glanced over to the other platform, where he saw the express sitting, waiting for Gordon, the big engine. He admired their new shiny paint and was smitten, but he remembered what the Fat Controller had said. "I must learn to control my temper," he said to himself, "or I might never pull the express again." James's journey to the junction went smoothly. The trucks were well behaved, and James looked forward to his return trip. At the junction, he ran around his new train and awaited the guard's whistle to set out back toward the big station. But the guard's whistle never came. "We'll be late if we don't hurry," James said. "I know," said his driver. "The guard is on the telephone. An important message just arrived from up the line." James waited and waited, and finally the guard came up to tell them the news. "Gordon came off the rails just outside the big station," he said. "They're asking for another engine to help. You'll have to go, James. Be quick now." Without delay, James was uncoupled from the train and hurried up the line. When James arrived, he found Gordon on the side of the line, his coachers still on the rails. There was a lot of commotion as the crews argued about what to do about the big engine. The Fat Controller joined the crews and looked very grim. "This is the second accident we've had with the express this week," he said. "Gordon, what happened?" Gordon was too embarrassed to speak. "If I may, sir," said the leading coach, "this big engine would not stop talking about how clumsy James the Red Engine is, and in his gloating he left the station without waiting for the points to be changed. "Is this true, Gordon?" the Fat Controller asked. Gordon reluctantly muttered an agreement under his breath. "I see," the Fat Controller said. "James, you'll have to pull the express as there are no other engines available." James knew that this was his chance to regain the Fat Controller's trust. He coupled to the coaches and was careful with them. The guard blew his whistle and the train continued its journey down the main line. "Just let me know if I'm going too fast," he said to the coaches. "I want you to be comfortable." "Thank you, James," they replied. "We are going smoothly." Soon, James made the last stop and ran around his coaches to return home. The Fat Controller was pleased. "You've done a splendid job," he said. "You have shown me that you have learnt from your mistake. I would like to put you on express duty for a while until Gordon has learned his lesson." "Oh, thank you, sir," James steamed happily. When James returned to the sheds that night, he found Gordon sulking. "It seems to me we both have a lot to learn about coaches," James said. Gordon smiled. "Indeed, even veterans like me." Together, they agreed to be more cognizant of the needs of their coaches.
It's Thomas the Tank Engine, hip 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 hooray. Chugga chugga chug chug chuff chuff chuff, he rides along the way. And when you hear that whistle, it can only be one train. Our favorite little engine, Thomas is his name. Thomas the Tank Engine rolling along. All of his friends will be coming along. Thomas, we love you. He's a really useful engine with a heart that's big and strong. He chugga chugga chuff chuffs, working hard, helping everyone. Thomas, he has lots of friends and you can be one too. Just clap 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 and sing along. Thomas, we love you.